All right, I'm gonna let in the masses.
Yep. Right, we ready to get started, Jocelyn?
Yes, we are ready.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the final webinar in our Conversation Starters series, highlighting some of the chapters from our book, From Stigma to Strength: Cultivating Mental Health for a Thriving Family Business. We started this book with the intent of really opening a conversation about mental health that we feel has been overlooked for far too long in family businesses. Family businesses face unique challenges, unique stressors that can stress the family, the individuals in the family, and be a big part of the mental health struggles of many people. Um, so before we get started, I want to acknowledge a few of our partners who helped us put together this webinar series. Um, Loyola University Chicago Family Business Center, the Prairie Family Business Association, the Institute for Family-Owned Business, and the University of San Francisco Family Business Center. These are organizations that are out there starting conversations for family businesses about a lot of different issues. They're doing great work on behalf of families and helping families cultivate continuity in their family businesses. And we're really appreciative of their partnership, all they do for family businesses, and for helping us get the word out about mental health and the challenges that family businesses face. I'm delighted to be joined by a colleague, Diana Clark from Intent Clinical. Diana's the president of Intent Clinical and has over 20 years of experience working with mental health challenges, family challenges, and specifically with families of wealth and family businesses. So, Diana, welcome.
Thank you. So, slight inaccuracy. I have 20 years of doing this, or a few decades doing this professionally. I come from a family that was a family enterprise that did not succeed, and in part due to a mental health issue of my uncle. So it didn't survive the second generation.
Wow. So, what was that like as a family member to see a mental health challenge going on, and how did that influence you kind of coming to this work?
So I think this work is a natural result of growing up with it and learning that sometimes people who are struggling are honestly doing the best they can, and it can still create havoc in a family, and particularly in a family business. My uncle had bipolar disorder, and so he made some very irrational decisions. And my uncle's cousin, the business partner, could not tolerate that. And so instead of having the conversation of, I think you're really ill and you need help, it went through lawyers and a split. And so part of my mission in the way I work is, how do we protect relationships in our families, whether we're in business together or not, and talk about things that really matter.
Mhm. One of the things that really hit me hard when I was reading your chapter was when you said that for each person who's struggling with a mental health issue, there are at least four people who are struggling with their struggle, right? So if you think about that, that's the exponential impact of mental health on a family, on a business, on our society, right? So,
And we don't talk about it. So
right.
in substance use disorders alone, we're talking about, let's say, conservatively guessing, 25 million people struggle with a substance use disorder in the United States. By that math, 125 people are struggling with that,
Hmm.
either themselves or their loved one. And you don't hear that much about it. We're starting to. I see it on the cover of the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. More and more attention is paid to these difficult conversations, but it's still a shameful secret. It's as
Yeah.
if it occurs above the neck, we're not supposed to talk about it.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's really amazing because uh, we tend to think about mental health issues as an individual's problem, but really with those numbers, what we're talking about is it's a systemic problem. It's a family problem, and how the family reacts, how the family deals with it has a dramatic impact on whether the person gets better or not. And I'm curious as to why do you think it's so hard for people to talk about these issues, especially in a family business?
Mm-hmm. I think there are a few reasons. One, if you go very broad culturally, we are a culture that refuses to talk about mental illness and mental health supports. It's just done in secret. We are lift yourselves up by your bootstraps and make yourself go. My dad was a physician, and his line was, if it hurts bad enough, it'll fall off. And that's how I think about mental health in our family systems. If it hurts bad enough, something will happen and I'll pay attention. But right now, I'm going to ignore it. And we,
Yeah. So what's the impact when we don't talk about these things? I mean, I think I have some intuition, but like, what have you seen when families don't talk about it? How does that
so
unfold?
silence breeds a disorder growing in acuity. Let's take a mental health disorder of depression. Somebody starts isolating, they stop showering, their appetite seems to be diminished, they feel cocooned in misery, and if everybody treats them with kid gloves and stays away from the subject, it actually enhances the symptoms. It makes it ripe for growth of depression. So if somebody in that orbit said, honey, dad, mom, I'm noticing that you do not seem to be experiencing joy anymore, and you deserve to. Let's figure this out. It
Hmm.
doesn't have to be that we have the answers. We just have to be willing to approach with honesty.
Hmm. Hmm. So thinking about that, like, how do you start? I can just I think about it in my own family, and I think about, I've struggled with anxiety and depression at different times in my life, and I think about, you know, what that's like, and feeling what that's like to disclose that to my family, right? So how do I reach out and support? So how do you move beyond that stigma that we all feel around this to start a conversation, and when do you start it?
I think, to the extent that we're raising children, we should start having that conversation really young about feelings. We should start having that conversation when somebody joins a business practice. We're going to prepare for the likely that one of us, somebody in our family system, is going to have a mental health concern at some point. Somebody is. That's likely. So if we say, here is the way our family is going to react to concerns in that regard. We're going to approach individually. We're going to get two of us together if we need to because it's uncomfortable to do it alone. We are going to do a little research on what are the resources available to actually pass it off to. The
Hmm.
only thing that people have to do is get them to somebody else. We think we have to have the answers. We don't, and we can't.
Hmm.
And that fear that we don't have the answer keeps us from saying something.
Hmm.
And we are also,
One of the,
yeah,
go ahead.
no, go ahead. I can
I
go
was just
on.
going to say, you know, I think sometimes families also get uh, stuck with the ambiguity around certain mental health challenges because we don't understand it. Like we can understand a broken arm because there's a picture that shows us that the bone is broken, but when does drinking become a problem? When does somebody's depression lead to behaviors that are problematic? I think that's also a part of what can make it hard to talk about this. Is like, I don't understand it.
Right. And I think the standards are moving. Alcohol standards are changing right before our eyes. It used to be in the papers that a glass of wine a day was considered good for you. That's not true anymore.
Mhm.
So, what is considered functional use is going to change as the messaging changes. If we have an image that somebody with an alcohol use problem is in the gutter, drunk, then we don't see it in our family, we don't see it in ourselves if we have a functional problem.
Mhm.
But
And
if we change that standard to
yeah.
how are you using alcohol, what's your relationship with alcohol like, is it a coping strategy for you,
Mhm. That's
then
what I
we
was
have a
going to
different
say
conversation.
is that sometimes these things go together. Like I'm depressed, so I start to use a substance. Or I've seen that with bipolar before, that substance use gets connected to medicate in dealing with the bipolar. So how how do you deal with it when there are multiple things coming in together?
I think that's where our firm actually does a really good job of looking at somebody and not just saying he has a substance use disorder, he needs substance use treatment. What we are really good at doing is saying, okay, he's got a substance use disorder, his marriage is falling apart, he has an anxiety problem that isn't being treated by a professional, and he is not getting any exercise. Every one of those things plays
Mhm.
off each other. So to think that there can be a simple answer for a very complicated issue. I was talking to a woman who was talking about her son, that he had an anxiety disorder and he was using alcohol as a way of medicating the anxiety. And I said, and he probably doesn't know that the rebound or the hangover from alcohol is causing more anxiety. So it becomes this loop.
Mhm.
Which comes first, and how do we address it?
Well, and I think that systemic nature is really, really important to understand. Is we can't think about this as an individual's problem because their behavior impacts everybody in the system. And our response impacts they how they seek treatment or don't seek treatment, whether they feel supported or unsupported. And I've been in a number of family meetings where a family member feels alone in their struggle because nobody wants to talk about it. So they feel isolated and they lean to other coping behaviors. Sometimes that's shopping, sometimes that's substance use. But we have to kind of understand that the family is a system, and anything that impacts an individual in the system and their well-being comes around and impacts the well-being of a family.
And conversely, in order for this single person to get well, the family system also has to be willing to do its part to make it a possibility in the confines of that family again. For
Mhm.
instance, let's imagine that I go to a hospital for depression and I leave behind four other people. When I come back into that system, if people are not able to talk about it, if they're not able to be supportive and have genuine conversations about how it impacts them, if they're not able to, absorb the idea that people get well and unwell at various intervals in their lives, it's going to make it very hard for me to be part of that system.
Mhm.
So
And
it
that really
preserves
that
relationships.
it requires vulnerability too. And I think we've been ingrained in our society at some level to see vulnerability as weakness. And, I think courage is actually having the ability to deal with the vulnerability and keep moving forward, stay in relationship with each other. It's the isolation that can make these things spiral out of control.
Brene Brown does a really good job of vulnerability as a superpower. And
Hmm.
some of her TED Talks are really powerful in that she talks about that we need to be
Hmm.
vulnerable in our families and
Hmm.
own where we fall down and where we are able to be supportive.
Yeah. And every major breakthrough I've ever experienced with a family has come because of somebody's becoming vulnerable and the family holding each other through the vulnerability, staying connected through the vulnerability and working through the issues.
Exactly.
So, I'm wondering, like, what are some of the unique stressors that you've seen impact the mental health in a family business context? Because obviously we've been talking kind of generally about mental health, but when we think about the family business context, the wealth context, what are some of the unique challenges you think
In the
families
family
face?
business context, I see it as the way that they are responding to an ill member. For instance, if you think about a seesaw, let's say it starts out they're even. When somebody becomes unwell, they may dip in their functioning, and that other party may start doing more. And they, as this person does less, other people in the business do more, and it actually can make it look like this person is still functioning when they're not, because other people have assumed the responsibilities. Outside of a family business where somebody may or may not be in a position of power or may not be in an emotional connection with other members of the business, people get fired. People are asked to take a leave. There's a lot more covering up that goes on in family businesses.
Mhm. I've heard a lot of people in family businesses talk about the image of the family. So that to acknowledge the mental health challenge is to kind of threaten the family image, the family brand.
Tarnish.
My
Yeah.
family was a well-known family in a small town. So, um, you know, uh, it was something that, like, let's not talk about it because, we don't want the gossip
Gossip.
people
Gossip,
in town.
right?
But that led to, the fact that my granddad had a drinking problem. Like there was this kind of undertone within our family of granddad shows up with a trunk full of liquor, or when he came to Chicago and he would always come fill his trunk with liquor because we didn't have the regulations in Illinois that he had in Ohio, but it becomes this family secret and we're kind of protecting ourselves.
Absolutely. And whether we realize it or not, we're protecting them. People use the word enabling. And so let's just even in a family business, base what I just discussed was the enabling process. Somebody is making that dysfunction bearable or comfortable. That is what enabling is called. I like to think of it as what we're actually doing when it's in a family is we're protecting. We're seeking to protect one thing, like their image. We're seeking to protect their livelihood. We're seeking to protect the news from getting to customers that a member of the family is really mentally unstable in managing their money. I mean, I can think of a whole host of reasons why it stays secret in the context of a family business. And every time we're protecting in that way, we're protecting the disorder from getting the help it needs. That's
And
how I feel.
it's really kind of paradoxical because we think we're caring for the person in doing that. We think we're protecting them, but we're not giving them the opportunity to get well, right?
We're
We're not
protecting them from change, and
right.
change means the opportunity to get well. You're right.
Yeah. And if we think about one of the most important roles a family can fill is fostering the well-being of its family members.
Yeah.
Like what a powerful message that could be that
Yeah.
our wealth is our well-being, not just our balance sheet.
And our legacy is our connection
Right.
that
What's
we
the relational capital that we're building in our
right,
families,
that
right?
we're building.
What's the strength of the relationships that we're building in our family? Because if our relationships are strong, our capacity is limitless, right?
That's right.
Because we can face any challenge. We can face
Together, together.
together, right?
What
Right.
happens in family business is that when one person is ill, very often there's a splitting that goes on. There is two camps, one that wants to deal with it in a firm way. I will use that because I don't want to be judgmental. It's still caring and loving. And then one that wants to go gentle.
Hmm.
And what happens is the individual who's struggling is either unaware or blissfully unaware of the dynamic that's going on below. And
Hmm.
that is the other members trying to deal with their dysfunction.
Yeah. And it actually can has the potential to be kind of reinforcing. Like I can feel pretty good that I'm so functional and the other person's not. But
Totally.
it can be reinforcing it like, okay, I get reinforced because I'm functional and the other person's struggling. And so it
They're
makes me feel
miserable.
good.
I'm not.
Right.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Wow. Now, just for everybody on the call, there's a chat box at the bottom. If you want to ask questions, please jump in and ask questions. I've got a few more things that I want to kind of explore with Diana, and then we'll keep going. But so if this is really hard, to for some people to start, um, how do you prepare for a conversation? How do you if I'm sitting here and I've got a depressed family member, somebody struggling with substance use, somebody anxiety, whatever, how do I prepare for that type of conversation?
So, in a business context, I would say, do I have your permission to raise something personal? I
Hmm.
think giving some in a family context, I'm more like, I'm going to have a personal conversation with you some point today. Can you let me know when that's okay? I need to express some concern. And you
Hmm.
give them, the idea that you're going to shock them
Right.
into getting well, right? With the big surprise.
You
Doesn't
invite them in.
invite them in
Hmm.
as if, you have those conversations all the time.
Hmm.
Pretend. Pretend this is a conversation about, the fact that they needed stitches.
Hmm.
They need care.
Hmm.
We're only looking to provide care.
Hmm. One of the things that came up in the conversation in our last webinar was, we were talking about dementia and the cascading effect on the family of dementia and the importance of building a support team or a care team. When you think about that idea, like what should a support team look like for a family in these situations? Like, if we can reasonably assume that we're going to have some family members that deal with mental health issues, what should we be doing to build a support team?
I mean, I have sort of a fantasy that families have family meetings, and during those family meetings, it's solicited ahead of time. Are there concerns about any one of our members?
Hmm.
So that that can be brought out as a matter of course that we talk about these things. It could be that whoever solicits that says to the individual, I received an input that you are struggling, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable with us supporting you at the meeting, and if not, how we can.
Hmm. Yeah, it's how do we acknowledge that there's something going on and communicate love and support at the same time, even though it's going to be uncomfortable. Um, and I would imagine that there's going to be some resistance. Yeah.
Totally.
So,
My dad was in a major depressive episode, and he was going for electroconvulsive therapy, and he was in his late 80s, and he was saying that it wasn't worth it anymore, and he was very talking about dying by suicide. And I said, "When's the worst moment for you?" And he looked puzzled that I would even ask. Like I was just curious, when is the worst moment for you? And he said, "At about 3 in the morning." I said, "Yeah, I get that. Why don't you call me?" And he got fairly defensive and fairly caustic and said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Absolutely nothing, but you won't be alone."
Wow.
And that's the key for all of our family members. We're not supposed to have to be alone. We're not built for it.
Mhm. That's really powerful. I've heard from so many families over the years, either individuals or the family as a group feels alone in their struggles. They feel like nobody can understand the unique pressures in being in a family business. I've worked with
Yes.
countless successors who feel like they don't have peers that they can talk to, right? Because their friends from college may not have come from a family of wealth. Their family might have a well-known brand.
Elevated in the community, so they can't be
Right,
particularly honest in their communities. Yeah.
right. But how powerful it would be if we could acknowledge the realities and the struggles that somebody was going through and say it's going to be okay. Maybe I can't solve the problem, but I can be here with you, right?
With you, so you're not alone
Yeah.
with it. Yeah.
One of the this brought back a memory of my father died at 52,
Mm.
and I was I would say I was in a pretty significant depression at the time. I was 22 years old, and I had people coming to me saying, "I know exactly how you feel, right? I lost this person, I lost that person." That just like that was complete disconnect for me. That made me feel even more alone. And the most powerful moment that I had in that was somebody that I worked with who you know, knew but didn't really know that well, just said to me, "I have no idea what this must be like for you, but just I want you to know that I'm here. And if you just want to have lunch, if you want to go out after work, let me know." Uh,
Love
Not
that.
pretending to know what I was feeling, but it was that curiosity. It's like when we try to compare our experiences to somebody else's experience, it's distancing, right? And
Correct.
it's it's
Correct.
having a reaction like you had or this person in my life had, which is a curiosity of like, I want to know and acknowledge your experience.
You're
I,
not somebody who needs to be shied away from. I can get closer even though you're suffering.
Mhm. That it reminds me of the Gottman research, which is like the most successful couples are the ones that turn towards each other rather than away from each other in a difficult
That's
moment,
right.
right?
That's right.
And for a family, you could argue probably that the health of a family is what is our capability of staying connected in the conversations that we need to have to work through difficulties, right?
Exactly. That's the measure.
Yeah.
How, as a family, do we support one another, talk with one another, and navigate challenges to well being?
Mhm. If you think about that in a family business context,
Wow.
our capacity to be successful as a family business is directly correlated with that
Uh,
ability to work together, to work through difficulties, right?
100%. And the thing I always feel about family businesses is they never, I mean, most of us get to sort of leave work these days, although not really with the advent of computers, but there is no leaving work when you're in a family business. Your holidays are your family. Your everything is intertwined, and the need to be able to say no more today is
Mhm.
critical for families, whether they have one person struggling or not. It's a skill.
Yeah. I I think it's really easy in a family business to get caught in the trap of doing, right? And we miss the opportunity to be together,
Mm,
to connect with each other because we're so busy doing. We have to put together the agenda for the board meeting. We have to make these decisions on the trust. We have to blah, 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 insert question there.
It's a great point.
But how do we move from all the stuff we have to do to being together and building our relationships? Uh,
Well, again, I believe that we're going to have to set aside time. We're going to have to be able to say, this is going to feel like an artificial structure initially. We're going to have family meetings about how we can be with each other uncomfortably and comfortably.
mhm.
We're going to have honest conversations and have a forum for it, have a
Yeah.
facilitator, have somebody who takes charge of this. And it is going to feel wrong. It's going to feel like tinfoil in the teeth initially, but you can get used to that.
Mhm. And I think you have to be careful not to create so much structure to your family meetings that again in that doing mode. Create
Exactly.
space in the meetings so that we can have time to relate to each other, that and realize that if we're in a really important discussion, the agenda probably doesn't matter as much as staying in this conversation, right?
Correct.
And I think every family has people who want to stay on agenda, but can we keep attention on the importance of a conversation, the depth of a conversation, and not get too caught up in staying on agenda and thinking about more of like, what's the relational outcome if
If
we,
we actually stay in this right
yeah,
now. Yeah.
yeah. And that's that power that of cultivating that relationship, which is,
Yeah.
you know, it feels like with the busyness of life that it's really easy to avoid connection. I'm guilty of it like anybody, you can look at my schedule and be like, how the hell do you stay connected to anybody in the midst of this?
Mhm.
Um, but if you think about it, for happiness, for well-being,
For
cultivating
longevity.
connection. Yeah.
They talk about I think it's the Harvard study of longevity that studied men for 50 years or whatever. The ones who did the best were ones in long-term marriages. The ones who stayed connected to
Hmm.
their families did better in longevity, even.
Hmm. There's another study that showed that children who know their family history and are connected back at least two or three generations have lower anxiety.
Interesting.
That when we feel more grounded and connected to
History.
uh, the history of a family, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, that it lowers the anxiety of kids. And you think about that in the days of social media and the anxiety that social media can create, really powerful, really powerful. Um, as you think about
I think
this,
we have a question,
oh,
Andrew.
we have a question that came in. Thanks. How do you address some of these issues with family members that shut down completely and will leave before they become vulnerable or even discuss the issue and then just expect to be forgotten? Avoidance. How do you deal
Avoid.
with the avoidance?
Avoidance is, I go at avoidance head on. Like, I can see that you want to avoid this conversation. And frankly, I'm going to let you avoid it right now. But you can't avoid the conversation ultimately. And I'm going to keep coming back. So you may as well get it over with.
Mhm. You know,
That's one approach.
yeah. And, a variation on that is it seems like this might be a really hard conversation for you right now, and I get that. So I think it's a really important conversation for us to have. So when you're ready, let me know. I'm here.
Exactly.
I'm going to ask you periodically over the coming weeks if you're ready. So think about that. And then you're to your point, you have to be persistent, right? You have
Totally.
to say, I'm not going to be the one that buries this under the rug.
That's
And
right.
but how do we do it in a loving way? I think is the really, because I speaking for myself, I know my first attempts at trying this in my own family, I can be really kind of judgmental and harsh at times and think like, why are you avoiding? But how do you make it an invitation with love, right? That
Think if we really come at this as not that there's something wrong about them, not that there's something wrong with them, but that they are somebody, could be us today, and it's them today
Hmm.
instead. And so I think if we approach all conversations, hey, it's really apparent to me that you're struggling,
Hmm.
as I would want you to come to me if you saw me struggling, I feel the
Hmm.
need to show you that I care.
Hmm. Well, and just acknowledging that you see it, um, will impact them, right?
Totally.
Especially if you can do it in a loving way and not for you can't force somebody into one of these conversations at some level, right?
That's right.
Um, but always kind of thinking about how do we do this with love, is, I think, really important. What are some of the really successful, if you could think about like three keys to successful conversations as a family, if I'm sitting out there and I'm thinking about I want to start one of these conversations with my family, what are three things that need to be a part of that conversation?
It's a great question. Give me a minute. Three things that would need to be a part of that. There would need to be, to your point earlier, curiosity. What is it like to be you? Two, the ability to empathize with that might be difficult for them without making it about us, because that's often very hard. We get caught up in the, I can feel their pain and it's so painful,
Hmm.
that we shut down. And the third is really just be prepared. The only thing you have to do is keep the door open for the next conversation. There
Hmm.
is no fix. Go in with an open ended mindset.
Hmm.
The object is to talk, not
Hmm.
to fix.
Hmm. So obviously you do this every day, and your team does this every day. How can advisors play a role? There may be some advisors on this call.
Mhm.
Like, how can advisors help advance these conversations and support a family through this?
Well, I think advisors, if they do these conversations, are there things we should know about at intake or at an onboarding time? How do you want to address any concerns I might have about your functioning down the line? Because people age. You can use it about aging. When people are younger, you can say, when you're 100, we may have to have a conversation about functioning. But in case we have to have one sooner than that, how do we want to do that? Is there a form you prefer?
Hmm.
Some people like to have things done in writing. Would you like me to send you a note? And if you're sending a note of concern, don't make it an email
Hmm.
or a text.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
It just raised a thought, like, are there any unique aspects of the younger generations these days, given that I'm no longer next gen anymore, but any unique challenges that you're
Yeah,
seeing?
they're much more receptive to talking about mental health.
Mm.
Way more. They think we are ridiculous. There are quotes by people who are much younger, like, this job isn't good for my mental health. You would have never caught me saying that 50 years ago.
Hmm.
It's not good for my mental health. Simone Biles' discussion about her mental health. All of
Hmm.
these things are much more accustomed. What I'm not seeing, even though they're willing to talk about the problem of despair and suffering and depression and substance use disorders, what I'm not quite getting from that generation is, it's like the pendulum swung that way without the component of a solution.
Hmm.
They're used to talking about their suffering, but without action. And
Hmm.
so I think my generation was all action and no talk. I think somewhere in the middle
Hmm.
is where we're going to get. Okay, I honestly hear how difficult this is for you. And I'm not here to fix. What do you think would be something that would be helpful to you that you could do tomorrow?
Hmm.
Tie it to action.
Hmm. That's really powerful. Yeah. You know, I have one last question before we wrap up. And that is really, I get asked about boundaries all the time. And I think oftentimes that uh, it can be hard to know what's the boundary, like what's private in a family. Like, so when somebody's struggling with something, what's private and what's the
I think
purview
we
of the
can
family.
ask. I think we
Mhm,
don't have to assume. I notice that you're struggling. Is this a private matter or would you like to talk? We can
mhm,
assume, we can ask that question. Is this private? Frankly, I don't think a mental illness or the well-being of one of our tribe is a private matter. And I think we can express that opinion. What
mhm,
hurts you hurts all of us.
mhm, mhm. I think that's really powerful. That if we see the pain, that pain exists, right? Right. And even if we're not talking about it, that pain is going to be felt throughout the system.
Totally.
Going to acknowledge it? Are we going to talk about it? Are we going to work through it? Or are we going to stay isolated?
Exactly. Those are the choices, isolation or connection. And
Hmm.
connection requires talking.
Hmm. That raised one additional question, which is around neurodiversity,
Hmm.
um, because you know I've worked with families with that have people who have neurodiversity and they can't experience emotions in the same way as other family members. I'm just curious if you have any reflections on neurodiversity in the midst of all these conversations.
That really requires the curiosity. That requires what is it like for you to hear blank?
Hmm.
It really requires because you're asking them to translate what is not neurotypical for you
Hmm.
so that you can connect. I want to connect with your experience better. Can you tell me what it is like when you drink? What's it like when you cut? What's it like for you when you can't get out of bed? I
Hmm.
want to connect your experience.
Hmm. And I think one of the things that I've had to help coach family members on over the years is to mourn the loss of the ideal person on the other side. Like, I want this magical response from you, but you're not able to give me that response. So how do I mourn the loss of that and deal with what's in front of me, right?
And sometimes really reflect on your lack of what I would consider to be acceptance and love for that other person by trying to make them something they're not.
Mhm. Yeah, how do we move from the identity of who somebody thinks they are to who the essence of who they are? How do we
They
accept
are.
somebody for who they
That's right.
are,
Yeah,
not because they're the CEO, because they're the chairman, because they're a millionaire, you know?
right.
So good. Well, this has been really, really engaging. I really appreciate, first of all the time you put into the chapter and contributions to the book and for kind of ending our webinar series on a bang. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to what I like to call beat the drum for family wellness. Yeah,
Yes.
that's my mission.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Our well-being as a family is truly uh, a measure of our wealth as a family.
yeah, that's great. Love that.
So
Yeah.
awesome. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you.
All right.